In the 21st century, Ontario remains a landscape dominated by forests. Indeed, in some areas, forests are expanding, reclaiming through natural succession lands formerly cleared for agriculture. Afforestation programs are actively putting forests back and connecting isolated woodlots. Public participation in the forest management planning process is now the norm, and a dialogue with Indigenous communities is part of the process as well. Progress is being made by the sharing of knowledge and the building of mutual trust and respect. But Ontario's forests continue to face challenges, both old and new. In southern Ontario, the tension between forestry and agriculture remains, as economic pressures on family farms increase the need to plow under the few remaining windrows and fence lines. Our cities are growing at rates not seen since the post-war boom, and the suburbanization of rural lands seems more of a threat to woodlots than agriculture. At the same time, the demand for forest products continues to grow. In our forests and urban areas, new, virulent, invasive species are threatening the very existence of some of our most common native trees. And looming over all of this is climate change, the impacts of which are still unclear as to their nature and speed. And we're also changing our understanding of what forests are, where they exist, and who manages them. Government and the forest industry have had 20 years to adapt to the roles and responsibilities defined in the Crown Forest Sustainability Act of 1994. The Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources and Forests are responsible for monitoring compliance and providing manuals and guidelines to be followed. It is the role of industry to prepare forest management plans and be responsible for their successful implementation. Less than half of Ontario's Crown forests are available for management. That portion, about 25 million hectares, is divided into blocks called management units. Forest management within each unit is the responsibility of a Sustainable Forest Licensee, or SFL. The terms of their license require that before any activity takes place, they must have an approved long-term plan with input from the public and Aboriginal communities. The plans cover both harvest and the renewal of a natural forest landscape as set out in the Crown Forest Sustainability Act.
The Crown Forest Sustainability Act ensures that everything is done in a way that it's sustainable. And, you know, we have to use every tool that's in the toolbox, we have to use it to achieve what we need to achieve. And that, basically, what we're trying to achieve is survival. You know, survival for us as humans, survival for the animals, survival for the plants, survival for the fish, and survival for the clean water, especially.
The idea is that we're trying to produce a natural landscape, and what this means is it doesn't just mean a landscape of trees that are the right age for harvesting. This means old growth forests. This means young forests. This means intermediate age forests. So we must consider a landscape that has all of these forest types and all of these forest ages represented.
There's all the time some disturbance going on. Forest is growing, succeeding from one type of forest to another type of forest. The shade-tolerant species grow under the shade of less tolerant species. It's a very natural process that is constantly taking place. Plus, there are all kinds of natural disturbances like wind, drought, insects, ice, flooding, fire occasionally as well. So there's major dynamics going on in the forest that takes place regardless of what we do.
So what we need to do is to produce a variety, a diversity of different habitat types that reflect the diversity of natural conditions that wildlife would be exposed to. And this is the way that we can comply with what the Crown Forest Sustainability Act wants us to do.
The SFLs had to implement the very best forest practices if they were going to meet the goal of sustainability. They depend on professional foresters, ecologists, and biologists who study human and natural disturbance, how they affect forests, and how various plants and animals adapt to these changes.
So a professional forester is like a detective, looking at the adaptations that different plants and animals have and the disturbances that take place in the forest, natural disturbances. We look, for example, how fire spread, which trees are killed, which trees survive. We look at wind disturbances, we look at insects and diseases, and how that also affects forests. Then we can also look at human activities, like forestry activities, and compare that to the natural disturbance and the adaptation that plants have, and the forest has. And look at if they're similar or different. If they're different, then how can we change those human practices, our logging practice, our regeneration practices, to more closely match what nature does.
In deciding what management approach to use, the forester begins by looking at the forest as it is now, as it was in the past, and as it might be in the future. Forests change through a natural pattern of disturbance and regeneration. Each of the management approaches emulates a different degree or type of disturbance. Based on the species present and the site conditions, the forester selects the approach that will create the best forest for the future. These poplar trees began growing here in the late 1990s after this area was clear-cut. Poplar stands like this are normally a product of forest fire. To regenerate and thrive, poplar needs the full sunlight and large openings that are created by intense fire. The fire suppression policies of the late 20th century significantly reduced the frequency of that type of natural disturbance. As a result, pure poplar stands are relatively uncommon in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest. Now these trees in about 60 years are going to start to die off and be replaced by other species. If we wish to conserve this stand, we need to recreate the conditions that produced it. Without a forest fire, the only way to do that is with a clear cut.
It's important to understand that clear cutting is still producing something that is called early successional forest, which is definitely required by some species of wildlife in order to function. And without it, they will basically move somewhere else if they have somewhere else to move.
Poplar is not the only species whose natural regeneration is specifically adapted to forest fire, and as a result is best managed through clear cutting. Called shade intolerant, many species need large openings and full sunlight to thrive. Tom Dolan, a forester with the Algonquin Forest Authority, is using this method for jack pine regeneration.
Jack pine have what are called serotinous cones, so they need heat from either a fire or post-logging to get the cones to open, and that's something that they've evolved through time. That's their kind of strategy to regenerate. We don't do very much clear cutting in Algonquin Park. It's probably less than 5% of our forest is clear cut. But in a jack pine forest, we need to do a clear cut to regenerate it. And because Algonquin Park is kind of on the edge of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest region, we have in our forest management plan some objectives to try and maintain this jack pine on the land base so that it's still here over time, because we don't want to kind of lose it.
When people talk about clear cutting, a lot of people I hear say, oh, you clear cut to maximize the volume out of the cut. And we clear cut those species that only regenerate with full sunlight, and that's why we clear cut. We manage white pine and the shelterwood system because of the light conditions that they required. And the same thing with hardwoods. So it's all about the light and how much light they need or how much light they don't need, and that's how it's being managed.
Clear cutting is uncommon in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, but it's used regularly in the spruce and jack pine forests of the boreal. Up until the 1990s, clear cutting literally meant cutting all the trees. Recent studies on how best to emulate the impact of fire have led to new ways of managing.
The Crown Forest Sustainability Act, when it said that we must emulate natural disturbances to the extent possible, this is when people started looking more closely at what a natural disturbance really looked like. It isn't just the shape or the size of what a natural disturbance is, it's what a natural disturbance actually does to the forest. When a natural disturbance creates a new forest, there are all sorts of individual trees left standing.
And this is true of vegetation or forests around the world. Wherever fires occur, this is what happens. Some trees get killed right away, some trees get damaged and die later, and some trees survive a long time. So we took that understanding and we use it in our practices today.
That was probably the most critical change we could have made in how forestry was undertaken in the boreal forest and in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest region.
In some parts of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, white pine is a dominant tree species. White pine is considered mid-tolerant in that it doesn't like too much sun, nor does it like too much shade. Although it responds well to fire to get a head start on other species, a typical clear-cut isn't the best management approach. Uniform shelterwood is a forest management approach that removes the older forest in stages to create just the right amount of sunlight for species like white pine and red oak. Depending on the conditions, tree planting may be used to help the young forest get started.
So this is a white pine shelterwood seeding cut here. In a white pine shelterwood seeding cut, we're trying to emulate a natural understory burn and regenerate white pine. In this particular spot, it was harvested about 7 or 8 years ago, and we've come in and roughed up the soil and planted some trees, as well as got some natural regeneration from some of the overstory trees. So if we kind of fast forward into the future, roughly 30 or 40 years later, the trees get to be this size. So when the trees get to be this size, we're ready for the next stage of the shelterwood system, which is the final removal. So in the final removal, we start taking off a lot of those big trees. We don't take all of them. It's important to leave a few for structural diversity and for wildlife values and those sort of things. It's good to have those big trees on the landscape.
The more complex or diverse the forest, the tougher these decisions are. This is a mixed hardwood and conifer forest growing on the typically rugged topography of the Canadian Shield. Sites like this are common throughout the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest. Here, diversity of tree species and site conditions vary so much over such short distances that emulating natural disturbance requires a very flexible approach. Areas of maple, beech, and ash, species that are shade tolerant and grow well beneath their older, more mature ancestors, would be lightly cut to maintain existing conditions. Areas of red oak and white pine would be more heavily cut because they need more sunlight to regenerate. And there are areas that would not be cut at all to protect wildlife habitat and other non-timber values.
We have things like deer wintering yards and moose aquatic feeding areas. They're a protected area, now called moose emphasis areas. When you're doing forest management, you have to look at all these and you have to make sure that there's enough of that over the landscape to actually serve the population of the species that you're trying to protect.
No harvest plan is simple. In order to exploit natural regeneration for all the species present, the forester must modify the degree of disturbance created by the harvest. This is the essence of adaptive forestry, the constant adaptation of harvest to site and species composition. While this is done in all forest types, in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence forest, It is the intensity of the adaptation that dominates. In order for this system to work, the logger running the chainsaw or the mechanical harvester needs to know what trees they're allowed to take. These marks on the trees tell them what to do. The exact pattern varies depending on the overall approach, but the purpose is always the same. The logger will know what trees they can cut and what they must leave behind, and the cut can be monitored afterwards for compliance. The decisions and marks are made by certified tree markers who follow specific instructions written by foresters.
Tree marking is very unique to the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest region. Basically, prior to trees being cut, every tree is looked at by a forester or by a trained technician, and they make decisions on tree quality or on the wildlife values, and they walk every acre.
The easiest way to think about tree marking is that you take the worst, leave the best. So it's like you're investing in the future. We are in no way going through and cutting the best trees. That's the exact opposite of what we would do in forest management.
In the past, we marked trees to improve timber growth. We continue to do that, but now we're looking for new values. We're looking for red-shouldered hawk's nests and protecting them. We're looking for vernal pools that have amphibians in them, or cavity trees that have woodpeckers. And tree markers are identifying and protecting those values as part of their day-to-day business.
Not all Crown Forest is intended to be harvested. Some is set aside to be managed solely by Mother Nature. Older, relatively undisturbed forest has significant ecological and cultural value. For many people, old growth is the ultimate forest, where all the possibilities of a site have been allowed to progress through time to create something unique. These types of forests were more common in the past, and the few remaining examples are precious.
You know, the ecological factors that were involved in creating this forest date back half a millennia at least. That predates Columbus, right? You can't replace these trees. Once they're gone, they're gone.
What we came to realize is that old growth had additional ecological values, it had social values. This was brought to light mostly up in Temagami, Ontario, but many other places, and it became part of planning. There's now old growth policy to address the fact that we wanted to grow some forests beyond their commercial rotation. We wanted to grow them to be as big as they could be.
Ontario's forests have been actively logged for over 200 years. Throughout that time, large tracts were cleared for agriculture, but the light soils were unsuitable for farming, and the removal of trees led to serious soil erosion, and many of them were abandoned. As early as the 1920s, the provincial government began assisting municipalities to reforest these wastelands. This was the first real expansion of forested land in Ontario since the end of the days of settlement.
There was a massive afforestation effort done in Eastern Ontario over the last 60 years, 70 years. Larose Forest is one of the earliest, largest community forests that has been replanted on a lot of the blow sands that were there. And all throughout Eastern Ontario, even across Southern Ontario, is that we've done a number of afforestation programs trying to convert that old marginal farmland that's been abandoned back to a forest. But we just can't do that overnight. We do that through the planting of conifer species mainly, and over time through progressive thinnings is that we will have a mixed hardwood conifer forest that will hopefully within 100 years or maybe even longer perhaps mimic more of our natural forest.
Starting in 1950s during the agreement forest era, the county in partnership with the Lands and Forests at the time, now MNRF, started purchasing properties that were deemed to be better suited for forestry purposes than agriculture. So we're standing in a red pine plantation that was planted in the 1950s that used to be a farm field.
Communities across Ontario own and manage over 100,000 hectares of forests. Returning these lands to their natural forest takes time. It's also a gradual process, where the forest changes dramatically from a pure pine plantation with trees in rows to a mixed forest with a variety of trees of different ages and sizes. Tree marking and harvest guides the transition to the natural forest that suits each site. Throughout the process, the goal is to improve the quality and diversity of the forest ecosystem.
With the forest, it takes a long time, but being observant and always going back to see what we did it work, did it not work, and then tweaking our management styles and the things we do, the machinery that we use, the different planting methods, planting stock, looking for cones. This year is going to be a bumper crop of cones. And it's being observant and seeing what's happening and what's working, and our failures, and grasping our failures and realizing that didn't work. Okay, so how do we make it work the next time?
In sustaining and even expanding forested land, communities and local citizens are stepping into roles traditionally left to the provincial government and its agencies. These new stewards are managing forests to meet the same social, economic, and recreational needs as Crown forests, but in ways that reflect local values and input. It's another way that the citizens of Ontario are becoming directly involved in sustaining their forests for the future. The largest portion of non-Crown-owned forests in Ontario, over 7 million hectares, belongs to private landowners. That's more forest than found in our provincial parks. Sizes range from thousands of hectares down to small woodlots. The good stewardship of these forests is a gift to us all.
When we're talking about Eastern Ontario and Southern Ontario, over 90% of the land base is in private ownership. So those individual woodlots that you see when you're driving down Highway 7 from Ottawa to Peterborough, on both sides of the roadways, that's all private land. It's all owned and managed by private landowners. But who benefits from that? It's society as a whole. All the individual people living in those regions or those watersheds are benefiting from that private landowner's commitment to doing good stewardship, doing good forest management, retaining that forest cover on their property.
Private landowners have title, meaning that in general, they can manage their land as they wish. The Crown Forest Sustainability Act does not apply to them, but fortunately, many landowners are committed to sustainably managing their forests. For over 30 years, Jerry Lee has owned 400 hectares in Lanark County. Recently retired from the Canadian Wildlife Service, he has more time for hunting and trapping, but his greatest pleasure is observing the wildlife on his property.
My vision is to basically leave it as a standing forest. I will do some logging, but when I do that logging, it'll be with the intent of either improving the stand or from a habitat perspective. There's been some work done by the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry that puts values on ecosystems that are managed by private individuals. They've demonstrated there is a societal value for having somebody keep these forests intact in place.
Like Jerry, Tony Bull, president of the Eastern Ontario Model Forest, understands the value of good forest management. He does some logging when the forest needs it, but his real passion is to see the land revert back to natural habitat for the native species.
I guess what I think of our bush is it's a host to all the naturally occurring native species of flora and fauna. And we are, as very powerful interlopers on this environment, we have an obligation to make sure that those species have a home and that they can thrive. There's no doubt that from a biodiversity conservation point of view, all people of Ontario benefit. It's a public service that is provided to people by private landowners. But frankly, we get the greatest benefit from this private land, really. I mean, I'm happy to play a role in support of society at large. It'd be nice to get more recognition of it, but the problem is society at large live in cities by and large. And to them, it's either a mystery or it's invisible in their own thinking.
In some parts of the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Forest, private land forests have been cared for by the same families for many generations. More often, though, private lands change hands regularly. Successive landowners may not share the same commitment to sustainability, and much good work can be lost. One option for landowners is to place their properties with a land trust. These organizations are empowered to conserve lands for up to 1,000 years. Howard Clifford, president of the Mississippi Madawaska Land Trust, bought 485 hectares in Lanark County in 1981. At the time, a third of it had been clear-cut.
Well, the question was, when you have 400 acres that are being clear-cut, what do? The ministry recommended and started planting white pine, but within a year they came back and said, Howard, it's regenerating so naturally, we recommend just letting nature do its own thing. Well, tell you the truth, I was grateful for that, because deep in my heart, I thought nature really does know best. I envision this forest 100 years from now, and can you imagine children living within 100 miles of Ottawa, coming to a place with the majesty of old growth? I mean, for my children, my grandchildren, and their children, what greater legacy to leave a jewel like this untouched as much as possible by man.
Private landowners play a critical role in the sustainable management of Ontario's forests, and we all benefit from their good stewardship. But we also benefit from the community-based businesses that have been the economic and social backbone of so many towns in Ontario. They have been some of the most committed stewards of our forests.
I think of the families that have had mills for 3 and 4 and 5 generations who continue to go back and harvest the same areas, who manage to continue to be in successful business.
This is a forest that I remember being told when my Uncle Herb went away to law school, they came through here and they cut poplar logs to buy him a car that he could go to law school in. And a generation later, I came through and I cut the remainder of the poplar out, noticed it was a good stand, and we were able to plant these trees. And we'll let this grow, and when the pine comes free to grow, perhaps my children will come and take the pine out of this, and it just keeps going around and around.
They're committed because they have the rights to go back and harvest something that they manage. That means they'll build a road and they'll tree mark and they'll take care of a woodlot or a crown forest because they know in 25 years, 30 years, they get to go back again and benefit from all that management.
These local businesses are not just committed to good forest management, but also to research and education. In the 1970s, for example, Shaw Lumber, in partnership with the National Museum of Natural Sciences and the Nature Conservancy of Canada, established the Shaw Woods Nature Preserve. Since then, the Shaw Woods have become an outdoor education center, providing programming for over 3,000 students each year.
You probably find about 1,000 salamanders underneath that. This is what we call down woody debris, and this is a very important...
Education is also a primary mandate of the Ontario Woodlot Owners Association, the Eastern Ontario Model Forest, and Forests Ontario. They are at the forefront of providing assistance to landowners, hosting workshops, and providing training and educational materials. Forests Ontario, whose mission it is to be the voice of Ontario's forests, have also taken over delivery of the Ontario government's 50 million tree planting program. Ontario needs its forests now more than ever as we adapt to the challenges of population and climate change. Scientists and foresters are telling us we need more canopy cover for temperature control, more younger forest for carbon sequestration, and veteran trees as genetic repositories, and so on. We don't just need our existing forests, we need more forests in new places, in cities, towns, and backyards. And we need new stewards to protect and manage these forests in our future. Most Ontarians could be forgiven for considering forestry strictly a remote or rural issue, because that's where forests are. At least that's what we've assumed in the past. Now, more of us are realizing that our cities are also forests, forests that once were and could be again. This pleasant suburban neighborhood was once a forest and provided habitat for deer, foxes, porcupines, and a host of other plants and animals. Today, despite policies encouraging urban intensification, our cities are still expanding. As a result, more of Ontario's land base could be devoid of trees. To break this cycle, we need to recognize that urban forests are an integral component of the mosaic of forests throughout the province. Urban forests contribute to the same ecological functions as rural forests do, and they do it right where it's needed most, in cities, where these functions have been the most degraded.
It's a pretty inhospitable environment for trees. So that's a major challenge. In most cases, the trees are planted in soils that barely resemble soils. They've been dug up and shifted and polluted and compacted and so on. So it's a very difficult way, a very difficult place to grow roots. If you can't grow roots, you can't grow the tree that provides those benefits that we're looking for from the urban forest. So that means we have to be able to communicate with the people who are developing the built environment, the engineers, the planners, construction crews, and so on, to be able to make, as urban forest stewards, to be able to make the case that it's important that we have this growing environment for trees, something that will give them that much more of a leg up, if you will, to provide those benefits.
Across Ontario, cities and small towns are waking up to the importance of their urban trees. The damage caused by the ice storm of 1998, and more recently the destruction caused by the emerald ash borer, activated citizens to create and support urban forest advisory committees. One small town that's made a name for itself in the urban forest community is Carleton Place.
This is one of our natural environment areas right here. We call it Hackberry Park. It's got about 50
small town Ontario do not have the expertise on staff. And what you're seeing right across the province right now is registered professional foresters and certified arborists getting involved in urban forest committees, working with councils and also with staff within their communities.
One of the important things that we do here is we collect the seed from here.
Some of the things we're extremely proud of in Carleton Place is our homeowner subsidized tree planting program, where we have workshops with the homeowners, teaching them how to plant trees, but more important, how to maintain those trees. This work is extremely important to increase the forest canopy in the town of Carleton Place, and we know climate change is coming, and trees and urban forests are going to be very important in these small communities.
Let's start working through the tally sheet here now. We've recorded
Urban forests are an opportunity to expand Ontario's forests while providing a wealth of non-timber economic and social benefits. Municipalities, volunteer organizations, and individuals can participate in both conservation and forest production. By bringing the forest to the people instead of the other way around, urban forests make trees and their ecosystems part of everyone's everyday life, regardless of where they live. Forestry in Ontario begins the 21st century much better than it did the 20th. Legislation has finally caught up with good forest practice and put forest health first. We now know more than ever about forest ecology and forest processes, and that knowledge continues to grow and be transferred to forest practice. Modern harvest methods allow us to get more from less while having less impact. By doing a better job of matching the type and extent of disturbance to the site conditions, we do a better job of sustaining natural forest processes and productivity. The efficiency of the harvest is improving as the forest industry adopts new practices and technologies. In the past, changes in our understanding of forests were one factor that drove improvements in forest practice. The challenges we face now make continued research and technological development even more important.
The Petawawa Research Forest is Canada's oldest and largest federally run research forest, so we're essentially 100 years old. And that's a really important message, that the idea that you can't buy time in forestry or forestry research. You need to consider that some of the silvics of the tree species that we're dealing with are hundreds of years. So some of the research here at the PRF, because of its legacy and its age, is irreplaceable and unique in that respect.
So I'm here looking at the impact of different silviculture treatments on two things. We're looking at the long-term impact on the possible development of weedy recalcitrant species that could act as competitors against white pine. And we're also looking at these same silviculture treatments and how do they have an impact on the plant community, so specifically understory vegetation.
Detailed knowledge of our forests and how they are changing over time is essential for good management decisions. Walking and knowing the forest was and still is the foundation of good forestry. At the same time, foresters have always adapted new technologies to gather and interpret information. Both advanced data interpretation and ground-based observation and experience will be needed to meet the challenges of the future.
The enhanced forest inventory that we've been doing lately at the Petawawa Research Forest, we've become a real hub for this. So we have LiDAR flights from 2007, 2012, 2016, some terrestrial LiDAR and point cloud collection as well, plus the UAV LiDAR. So it's really sort of sophisticating how we know about the forest, because inventory is always a big challenge. What do we have out there? And it sounds like a simple thing, but it really isn't.
Well, LiDAR, for instance, it's basically lasers that are shot down at the earth very quickly and in rapid succession that bounce back to sensors or receptors in, say, a plane or a helicopter, or it could be an unmanned aerial vehicle, a drone. And the technology looks at the distances or the time the time that it took for the light to bounce back, and it can measure distance very, very accurately. And what you get with the computer integrated with that LiDAR system is a very accurate three-dimensional cloud. It gives you a really good idea, and it can enhance your understanding and your inventory of the forest.
At the same time, it still requires interpretation when you come back, and there are still things that those technologies currently can't see. They can't assess quality very well. They don't see diseases very well. They don't check in terms of whether you've witnessed an invasive insect as you're walking through that stand. So In terms of boots on the ground, for the foreseeable future, I think that that's still going to be required.
Meeting the challenges of the future also means research into new uses of wood and its byproducts, to decrease our reliance on non-renewable resources and reduce our carbon footprint.
The goal of our research is to introduce low carbon materials in the bioeconomy, in the modern economic system, where we range products from food processing industry down to aviation industry.
There are many new and different uses of wood from the forest, such as nanocrystalline cellulose, which has applications in aeronautics, thermoplastics, as components in cars, the bioenergy component.
And as you move forward, more and more invention will happen because the functionalizations of this material becoming very important. More functionalized you can make it conductive, you can make it optically active, you can make it transparent, you can make it opaque, magnetic.
And thinking about traditional uses such as wood for construction, architects are suddenly reawakening to the wonderful world of making buildings dominated by wood.
Forestry is the vanguard in humanity's efforts against climate change. We're well positioned and well suited to be the building material of choice throughout the next couple centuries. Wood has a lower carbon footprint than every other building material out there. It's completely renewable, it's completely sustainable, it's fantastic.
1 cubic meter of wood cut and transformed into flooring or banisters or walls is the equivalent of removing 1 ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere compared to if we were using steel or concrete.
Our goal is to not actually disturb the ecosystem. So what we try to do is we like to see where we can get the byproducts, which are already coming out from the industry, and how we can use that to make something which will replace a non-renewable material. So what we are trying to do is looking at where the demands would be and how we can mitigate that demand, by using those not resources but those byproducts that are coming out in the system. So this is a unique way to bring, forest product industry a new model of sustainability where they can meet the demand of the future electronic industry, housing industry, transportation industry, and all about that.
This increased reliance on forest products will challenge the goal of sustainability, just at a time when external factors are adding challenges to forest management. Climate change itself will affect forest composition and distribution. At the same time, alien insects and parasites are threatening whole species of our native trees.
If there is a crisis in the forest today, it's not connected to forest management. The crisis in the forest today is invasive species, and I'm thinking about historically and what we're seeing on the landscape today. Chestnut blight from the late 1800s, early 1900s, Dutch elm disease, white pine blister rust, butternut canker, beech bark disease, emerald ash borer, and now among wildlife, white nose syndrome in bats. These are all alien invasive problems.
All of these things are very distressful to people, and I think in our lifetime we'll have seen a shift of our forest, not because of forest management, but because of forces that are kind of almost seemingly beyond our control. And I think that is a rallying call for all of us to work together.
The need to work together and share perspectives and educate each other has never been greater than right now.
A new generation of Ontarians is starting to replace the one that transformed forestry in the late 20th century. The skills and passion they bring to the challenges of our time bodes well for the future.
And figure out the UT.
This generation reflects the greater diversity and inclusiveness of Canadian society. Abraham Francis, a Mohawk from Akwesasne, is currently in a master's program at Cornell University.
And so what I'm really interested in is the ways in which our culture is spatially distributed and how our values intersect with that culture, and also how that intersects with the biology present on the landscape, and how context-specific forest stewardship strategies can be developed for different stands.
Jessie Shaw is the 6th generation of Shaws involved in the family lumber business in Renfrew County. At this stage, she's learning everything, from tree marking to tending white pine regeneration to making telephone poles.
I went to school at Algonquin for forestry, and they said it was the most students enrolled in forestry that they ever had. And you look around the class and there's about 5 or 6 girls, which I don't think you would have seen, say, 50 years ago or whatever. So it's changing big time.
And then there is the next generation. These children are attending forest school in the Ottawa region, and they're being encouraged to explore and create their own meaningful connections with the natural world. They will inherit the forest we leave them, and they will manage it as they wish. It is our responsibility to ensure they have the skills, knowledge, and passion to be Ontario's next stewards.
What one should we read next?